Hello, welcome to Smoke and Mirrors, the podcast where we make sense of agricultural policy. Over the past few decades, we've seen a lot of renewable energy in the United States, including on farmland. This has become a major policy issue. So today I'm excited to have Greg Brophy from the Renewable Energy Farmers of America. Greg, thanks so much for your time. Can you tell us a little bit more about your background in this organization?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. I'm a farmer from Northeast Colorado. I do have a few head of livestock, but mostly I grow irrigated corn and watermelons here, fourth generation on this farm in Yuma County, Colorado. Did get to spend 12 years in the state legislature in Colorado, most of that in the state Senate. So I got to represent all of Eastern Colorado and worked on all these policy issues around energy and everything else at the state level doing that. And then here about a year and a half, 2 years ago, a guy named Jeff Risley came to me and said, "Hey, I want to start this organization called the Renewable Energy Farmers of America." So it's an organization that looks out for the interests of the landowners, the farmers and ranchers that are interested in or participating already in hosting renewable energy facilities. And so we got that off the ground here a little over a year ago. I'm on the board. So we're just now getting started and trying to roll the organization out. If you think about it, it has some similarities to the mineral rights groups like the National Association of Royalty Owners, for instance. That's a trade group, and we're a trade group. That's a trade group that represents the interests of folks who have hydrocarbon development on their properties, where they own the rights for that. A lot of times, the interests of the developers align with the interests of the landowners, but not all of the time from a policy perspective. So I think it's important
Absolutely.
to have a trade group that represents farmer, rancher, landowners when it comes to renewable energy development.
All right. And what's your footprint in the United States right now?
We have board members from across the country, and we have members now in, I think, 26 states. You know, we we have some states where we want to where we are more aggressively recruiting membership. You know, states that have more development or more interest in development, of course. But we now have members in 26 states.
Right. That's great. So I've lived and worked in New York, Illinois, Kansas, states that are different agriculturally and politically, and the renewable energy, you drive across the state, you see the windmills, you see the debates. I definitely get it. Can we start off though with just some key statistics on renewable energy? How much wind and solar is on farmland? What has the growth been? What's the footprint?
You know, almost all of the wind development is on agricultural land. And the footprint of a wind farm always sounds really, really big because they talk about leasing 50,000 acres, to do a 500 megawatt facility. But the truth is that each wind tower itself only encompasses like, I don't know, an acre, including the roads to access it. So there's really the actual footprint in a 50,000 acre leased up area is going to be, a few hundred acres of turbines these days. On the solar side of things, currently there's about the same amount of solar developed land as there is land under golf courses. So it's like, I think it's 0.5%. And I'm going to say something a little bit controversial here, I think.
We like controversy.
To start with, I will acknowledge that, over the course of the last 70 years, since 1950, we have lost about 300 million acres of farmland in this country. We went from 1.2 billion acres down to about 900 million acres. So we have lost acreage, farmland acreage. That's almost exclusively taken up by suburban sprawl and exurban sprawl.
Yeah.
I say this,
some of it is marginal lands that have gone out of production too. That's
true.
That's a part of it.
But most of it is to sprawl and roads. I say it's an absolute fallacy that we're losing farmland to solar development. Now, I did say just a minute ago, there are farm acres with solar development on them. So it might be, if they don't do an agrivoltaics type thing, that might be a temporary loss of that land for farming. But unlike suburban sprawl or roads, at the end of the lifespan of a solar development, you take all that stuff out of there and you can take it straight back into agriculture if you want. So it's not really losing agricultural land any more than putting it into CRP is losing agricultural land. So even if they build out the maximum amount that they think they can build out in solar, it's still just a minuscule amount of actual ag land that would be temporarily out of ag production. And again, that's if they don't do some sort of dual use, which more and more of the developers are looking at.
Absolutely. Yeah, the sheep and pollinators
Yeah, yeah,
and all
yeah. I mean,
that.
I got to hang out in DC with some folks who graze sheep under solar panels, and their stories are just fascinating to me. It got me really interested in it.
Yeah,
And so
yeah, yeah.
that's a legitimate dual use of land.
Right, right, right. Absolutely. And do you have an idea of the share of energy production that comes from wind and solar in the US?
You know, it depends, and it varies by state. And I did do a great study on this here recently. Some of the states that have some of the highest percentage of renewable, like South Dakota, I think South Dakota has the second most reliable grid measured by state in the entire country. More reliable. The only one that's more reliable than South Dakota is Washington, D.C. Imagine that. The third most reliable is Arizona. I think South Dakota was at 29% wind, and Arizona has the third most reliable grid in the country, and they're at like 13% solar right now and growing
Okay.
rapidly. Colorado at times produces, or Xcel Energy, the big public utility in Colorado. There are days when 100% of the electricity produced comes from renewables. They have really aggressive goals in Colorado to do more renewable electric generation. Personally, I think there's a limit to how much they can do because there will be a day in January when it's 20 below zero with the skip of snow and no wind, and you have to keep the lights on and the heat still on. So we're going to have all of the above energy sources for, as far as I'm concerned. Look, we got to keep the lights on. That's what matters.
Can we I mean, maybe let's start from a like you said, like, if you look at the share of total farmland in the US, it's small, but sometimes when it's in your backyard, it's a different story, and when we see renewable energy come to communities, but can we just go through what the process is? So how these what's the sort of local approvals, state approvals, like, how the what and I know it's not the same everywhere, maybe some of those differences are
It
important to
it
discuss.
varies. It varies by state, of course. So some states that the approval comes at the state level. In most areas, it comes at the local government level. But so what happens what happens at the beginning is, um, a developer will look at a region and try to determine, um, like in Colorado, what's the utilities need as far as future generation goes. They look at what the existing infrastructure looks like. So if there's transmission lines with capacity or substations with capacity, so then they try to identify those areas. Then they go out and talk to landowners about the possibility of optioning their land into these facilities. So they'll offer you a per acre payment for up to 5-year option time while they start putting together all of the acres and then start through the permitting process. So after they lease up ground with an option to develop either solar or wind, and a lot of times now they're adding batteries into that, then they will approach the decision authority government. So in Colorado, that's at the county level. So they
Yep.
will make application to the county, and all of the counties now have a formal process for this with a set of rules. So you go in and you do the pre-application meeting with the planning and zoning department in the county, and they tell you, well, here's your requirements for this type of a project. So you have to go out and do all of the stuff that they want you to do. So you have your pre-app meeting with them. They tell you what's required. You fill out all of the application. You do all of the other notifications that are required. You got to notify everybody that lives within a half mile. You might have to find all of the people that own the mineral rights underneath the development and notify them, give them a chance to comment, watch out for what their interests are. After a couple months, usually, of putting all of that together, then you file the actual application itself. Then the staff reviews it and determines whether or not it's complete. And that's an important term of policy art. If an application has been deemed complete by staff, then it goes to the decision-making boards for their ultimate final approval and the granting or withholding of your permit to go further with the project. And then ultimately, after you get your initial permit, you got to come back to the board when you're ready to start construction and get your construction permit. But it's the initial permit, could be a special use review or a 1041. In
Yeah.
Colorado, we call it 1041 permit. Once you have that in hand, then it's pretty close to a done deal if you actually have off-taker times a project will have a power purchase agreement. A project developer will have a power purchase agreement with a utility when they start the leasing process for optioning land. Sometimes they go through on spec on all of through the permitting process, get a permit, and then seek to find a power purchase agreement with an offtake for the electrons. They never, ever, ever start construction unless they have a long-term deal with the purchaser of the electrons.
Okay, gotcha. So I wanna just recap a few things. There's a lot of details here, and I imagine this isn't even all of it. But so from the developer's perspective, from the energy producer's perspective, they need to get a sufficient number of leases to make the projects work in an area, and they also need to be close to some type of interchange or electricity grid infrastructure.
Typically,
Is that
yes. Yeah. Now,
okay? Okay.
because wind farms are so big and wind has become very efficient at producing electrons, so it's pretty low cost. They can actually afford to do what's called a gen tie or generation tie line to take from the wind farm itself over to existing infrastructure. That's called the gen tie line. Most of the solar developments that I'm aware of try to be really close to the existing infrastructure, so a
Yep.
transmission line with capacity to handle the electrons, because apparently the economics are such that wind farms can't afford to do 20 miles of transmission line. They'd like to keep their transmission lines a lot shorter, a couple miles.
Okay,
Or
that makes
gentie line.
sense.
Or gentie line.
And so these contracts with landowners, there's
Mhm.
typically some payment over an initial period where there's no construction or no construction guaranteed. And then if the construction happens, there'd be larger payments under a series of conditions over time.
Yeah, it's really lucrative. The option payments aren't that, they can be for solar, they're a little higher because they're leasing fewer acres. So I think the rule of thumb now is it's about 6 acres per megawatt of solar development. So if they want to do, 150 megawatt solar development, they need to lease up, roughly 900 to 1,000 acres to do that. Wind is different. They with the towers that they have these days, they have to place them so that they're at least 6, 7, 800 feet from anything that they might fall on. So they have to have them further spaced apart. They're using much bigger nacelles these days, like 4.5 megawatt nacelles. They will end up leasing a lot bigger footprint, so they necessarily pay a lot lower option payments per acre. So it might be 10, 15, $20 an acre for a wind lease option for per year for up to 5 years. Solar often's, closer to 50, maybe $75 an acre um, for leases. I mean, and all this that's all,
Yeah.
uh, that's all not a matter of public record. And if you're, in a lease, you're not supposed to disclose. Since I've had leases for both and I'm no longer under the disclosure, I can tell you that it was in those ranges. And then
Yep. Okay.
if you get developed, then they pay you um, more money per acre on the wind side. Plus, it's usually rule of thumb is it's about $5,000 per megawatt per tower. So if you have a 4.5 megawatt tower, you would get $22,500 a year. That's kind of the average payment.
Yeah.
If once they're up and operating,
Yep.
solar facilities, I've seen as low as for operating, I've seen as low as $400 an acre a year to as high as $1,000 an acre a year in lease
Yeah.
payments to the landowner. So it's big. I mean,
Orders
if
of
you get a solar
magnitude
develop,
bigger than farming. Is that a
oh, listen, I farm in Northeast Colorado. Over the last, I think I'm going to plant my 26th crop this year. Is that right? No, 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 no. My 36th crop this year. I'm old. On my non-irrigated farmland, I mean, for over 20 years, I might average $50 an acre a year in net profit. There'll be a couple of
yeah.
years where you'll get
Yep.
120. And there'll
Yep.
be
No,
several years where you might just barely break even.
I work in policy and finance in Kansas, so it's a tough business.
Yeah, so
Absolutely.
And on the irrigated ground, I'll make more money in good years. I might make, $500-600 an acre. So I'm not interested in letting my irrigated ground go into renewable energy development. But on my rangeland or on my non-irrigated farmland, I can't make anywhere near the kind of money that I can make off of a renewable energy development. And again, if you got a section of ground put into a solar facility or a couple of wind turbines on it, that's kind of like winning the lottery for your family. I mean, that sets you
Yeah.
up for
Yeah.
generations to come with
Yeah.
cash flow that's not dependent upon commodity markets. It's not dependent upon
Yeah.
rainfall or anything
Yeah.
else. It's just
Mm.
straight cash flow that helps you
Yeah.
bring another generation back to the farm or expand your existing operation. And it's a diversifies your income
Yeah.
stream. It's really valuable
Yeah.
to farmers and ranchers.
So I think this is a good segue to the next thing I want to cover, which is having legal representation. Because I mean, you do depend on the company that's making the payments and just, having a lease that works for the landowner. But it's something that, came up several years ago that farmers were signing leases without quite knowing the right language. Is that something that you've dealt with or you have any advice on?
You definitely need to have an experienced attorney on your side. And another reason why you might want to consider joining the Renewable Energy Farmers of America, if you join at the top tier, you can get access to non-legal review of leases and things like that. And what we can't do is we can't collude on lease rates and things like that. We can certainly tell people, here's what you need to be aware of. Here's
Yeah.
this, and
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it would be a great place if you don't already have someone to find an experienced attorney who can represent the farmer's interests, and you definitely want that. Most of the companies that lease from you, by the way, will give you a few $1,000s to offset the expense of seeking legal advice to look at the contract that they're offering you. And like anything in business these days, you don't. If, unless you've done it a bunch of times yourself, you definitely want legal representation
Yep.
from someone who has done this sort of thing multiple times already. It's no different. It's no different than, if you get in a car wreck, you might get in one bad car wreck in your entire life. If you're dealing with an insurance company, you should have an
Yeah.
attorney who deals with this stuff on a daily basis because you're just going to get taken to the cleaners if you don't know what you're doing.
Right, 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 right. Absolutely. That makes sense. And I want to dig into so most of the permitting, zoning processes, approval processes, those happen at the county level.
In Colorado, it's at the county level. I think in Kansas, it's at the county level.
Yeah, I think so.
Illinois and Michigan are both at the state level.
Okay. Okay.
Missouri is looking at doing a statewide moratorium on solar development, which is really annoying to me as a
Yeah.
property rights advocate. Ohio has some state laws that make development there a little more challenging. But in
Right.
most states, it's handled at the county or township level. I think township in Pennsylvania,
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
Colorado and in Arizona and Kansas, Nebraska, it's all done at the county level. So those are your decision makers. So it's your county
Okay.
commissioners here.
Yep. And it's my understanding in some states, counties or township, whatever the authority is, they can put into place bans or they can do things to restrict development. In other states, that's difficult or nearly impossible. Is that the right way to look at it?
Yes. Yes. Yep. Yeah. Again, in Colorado, I know the state legislature and the governor continue to look at trying to take over the authority for development of renewable facilities, but they haven't done it here yet. So the decision making is still at the county level. Like I said, I think Illinois and I think Michigan are two states where they centralize the zoning for renewable facilities at the state level.
Okay. Okay. Gotcha. Gotcha. And I mean, you must have dealt with this a lot. In a lot of communities, there's serious public pushback. I know in my hometown a couple years ago, there was pushback against wind farms, a lot of organization. And I want to unpackage this. I guess, first of all, what's your understanding of the major concerns that people have?
Well, so in this day and age, you can jump on YouTube University or the Google machine and find a study to justify any position that you want to take. either for or
Mhm.
against a thing. So
Yeah.
I think at the base, there's a couple of things that are going on here. At the base level, there are a lot of folks. It's just human nature. There's a lot of
Yep.
folks who are resistant to change. They don't
Yep.
want to see anything change. There's a so there's that at the base level, and
Mhm.
then in this country, in this day and age, as you know, everything has gotten so political.
Yep.
Either on Team Red or Team Blue, and
Mhm.
a lot of the folks that take the politics of life really, really seriously, and it becomes their reason for existing. They see wind and solar, renewable energies as blue energy, and they
Mhm.
don't want to host blue
Yeah.
energy in red counties. So there's an
Mhm.
element of that is of course, on the change side, if you're gonna like right now, I'm looking out my windows. I have a huge bank of windows that has the view of the sandhills in Northeast Colorado. I think it's one of the most beautiful vistas that there is.
Mhm. Yeah.
My
Yeah.
lovely wife, who
I've
isn't
driven
from
through
this area,
those.
doesn't
Yeah.
agree with me. So a renewable facility out there would change the way it looks. Just like here to the left, there is a center pivot irrigation field that changed the way it looked. It used to just be, a big valley with grass across it that you could graze cattle on.
Yeah.
Much higher and better use for it is to have, irrigated farmland there, but it changed the way it looks. Over the hill, there is a hog farm that definitely changed the way the area
Yeah.
looked and added a lot of traffic to the area. So a lot of times people are resistant because they don't want the landscape to change. They don't want the
Yep.
field across from their house or that they drive by on the way to town to go from being a wheat field that's summer fallowed and, wheat corn fallow, wheat sorghum fallow, whatever it is. They don't want
Yep.
to see it go
Yep.
from that to a solar facility that
Yep.
looks,
Yep.
different.
Yep.
And they don't want to see the big wind towers with the stupid red blinking lights all night. I don't blame them on that. There's technology to keep the lights off now, by the way, if you want to use
Well,
it, and you should employ it. State law in Colorado, to use that technology, which I love. Yeah. So those are some of the things. And then of course they will tell you that it's going to reduce their property values, that,
yeah.
it's going to give off electromagnetic, fields, all this stuff. None of that's accurate, but that's what you will hear. And I think just a
Okay.
lot of it is because people are resistant to change. I think there's a little bit of politics in it.
Yep.
Sometimes there's a little bit of envy in it. You don't want to
Yep.
see your neighbor get a
Yep.
deal that you didn't get.
Well,
Sometimes
if
there's a
it's a
little bit of that.
lottery and I don't get it, I think, yeah, I could understand you.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's Cornell put out a study here. Cornell University put out a study here I saw a couple of weeks ago that said a big majority of landowners and farmers and ranchers are interested in hosting renewable facilities on their place for the diversified income stream, et cetera. But a majority are a little bit intimidated by pushback from the local community and don't want to feel like they're being targeted by anti-development folks in the community. So there is a little bit of that in there.
Right.
And I always tell them, look, you got to stand up for the interests of your family. And if you
Mhm.
want this diversified income stream, you have to be
Yeah.
willing to stand up for it. And that's why we need a trade group like REFA to help people understand that they're not alone. You're not completely on your own here. You're part of a larger group of people.
Yeah. Yeah. And what would, I guess from your perspective or from a developer's perspective, what does success, I don't want to say successful, but what does effective community engagement look like? Like I wouldn't be surprised to see any of these concerns.
You know,
What's done to
what
sort of
you
work
all
through this?
you always have an open house in the community so that people can come in and you can tell them where the development's going to be, what you're doing to accommodate wildlife concerns and everything else. Because that's another concern is, of course, wildlife
Yeah.
and how will it impact, migration patterns, anything along those lines. So, you have an open house where you have, folks that can talk about all of this stuff to try to reassure the
Right.
other people in the community that everything's going to be, this is a great opportunity for the community to get new tax revenue, add a few jobs,
Yeah.
see a real boom from construction activity, and diversify the income stream for local farmers and ranchers and help them bring another generation back to the farm if that's what they want to do. So you always do the open house and have people ready to answer whatever the questions are. Is there
Yeah. Yeah.
how are you dealing with birds? Did you, have you studied for raptors, all of this stuff? And the answer is that a developer does all of that. They have to go through all that entire process. And I've even had a developer bring in a real estate expert to talk about, um, studies that he has done to indicate that it's not going to make your property values drop if you happen to be within a half mile of a solar facility or within a mile of a wind turbine, because they're always afraid that it's going to. Now
Yeah.
I do know that if the development is denied, the cooperating landowners definitely lose money in that deal.
Yeah.
They lose that lottery ticket that we were talking about earlier.
Yep. Yep.
Whereas in theory, someone directly across the road from a solar facility might or might not have a property valuation loss. So from a property rights perspective, that
Mhm.
is something that neighbors are always concerned about. If they live within a
Yeah.
mile or a half a mile of a
Yep.
solar facility, or even just
Right.
directly across the road, set back,
Yeah.
a couple hundred feet. First off, almost all counties have a required setback from non-participating landowners that can be anywhere from 500 even up to 1,000 feet.
Okay.
There's no conclusive study that shows that a neighboring landowner's home values will be reduced. You can, again, on the internet, you can find anything that you want to find.
Yep.
But
Yep.
what really is impacting your home value is interest rates and the state of the economy. We know for certain, though, that if that development is not allowed to go forward, then the landowner who wanted to host the development is definitely going to lose money. We know that's a certainty, because if you don't get it, you don't get it. And that's one of the main concerns that you hear from folks is concern over whether or not it impacts their property value. It doesn't. And if you are absolutely sure that it does and you can prove it, well, then you can seek a compensation for that. Our
Okay.
court system will allow for that sort of thing. The problem
Yeah.
is you try to do that, you are not going to be able to prove that you lost your property value. There's no conclusive proof of it, even though that's an issue that's almost always raised.
Yeah. Well, I think we've had enough development over the past decade. There should be some good quality research on that.
You know what, especially when it comes to wind farms, because we've now had wind farms in Northeast Colorado since 2001, and we had quite a few of them for 20 years now. So we know what negative externalities there are, whatever they are. Solar is new enough that we don't have quite as much of a history here, at
Right.
least in Colorado.
Right.
But
Yeah.
we will within just a few years. And the little bit
Yeah.
that we do know now, again, is I talked to a developer of houses who has a housing development very near a new solar facility. He said he hasn't seen a drop off at all in interest,
Yeah.
for buying in his
Yeah.
in his in his housing
Yeah.
development. So
Yeah. Yeah.
that's just anecdotal, though. But yes, within about 4 or 5 years, we will have a much more definitive group of studies that we can point to when it comes to property values.
That makes a lot of sense. So there's you have local or state approval processes. There's almost always some type of local engagement. If
Always.
there's strong enough resistance, I think, one channel is you convince your local authority to not approve it, or there could be some type of peer pressure, the right word. How often is that stopping developments, or does it really depend on the locale?
It depends a lot on the locale, but there's a significant percentage of development that gets turned down now. It's substantial.
Yeah.
It's much, much, much more likely to happen in a community where they don't currently have any other facilities already there. So the first wind farm offered in, County X in the middle of Nebraska is the hardest one to get through the permitting process. So like here in Colorado, Lincoln County and Kit Carson County in Colorado, which are along I-70 on the way to Kansas from Denver,
Hmm. Yep.
those counties host a lot of renewable facilities already. So people are either much more comfortable with them, or they find it, well, what's one more when I already have five? So it's not worth
Yeah.
fighting them
Okay.
in those counties. And the
Yeah.
commissioners have shown a willingness to allow for them. And then, by the way, in both of those counties, the tax revenue that comes from the development in Lincoln County, I think, is 65% of their total county budget. And in Kit Carson County, it's approaching 50%. So they're huge in those counties. There's another county just north of them called Washington County, and they have such strong, organized local opposition to wind turbines that it's their county-wide regulations are close to a de facto ban on development because of tip height restrictions and proximity to occupied dwelling restrictions.
Okay.
So it ends up being a little bit of either or. So you can run into a county where they just won't allow it, or you can find places where they value the property rights and the development rights and allow for a facility to be built. And
No, that
it's
makes sense.
very individualistic. And that's why advocates for this type of energy, if they have a compliant state legislature, might try to centralize the siting and zoning of renewable facilities at the state level.
Yeah.
And there's precedent for that. I don't like it because I'm a fan of allowing local people to decide what they want.
Right. Right.
But for instance, in Colorado, the decision making over drilling for oil and gas is done at the state level.
Right. Right. And I've seen a very wide variety of perspectives from within the agricultural community. I've heard a lot of people, property rights, that's just such a critical value. Like, say they're like, these are my personal feelings, but property rights. I've heard perspectives of where they're okay with solar, but they're not okay with wind. I mean, it's just, some people are against it all. Sometimes there's concerns about foreign ownership, but I've just heard so many different
Yes.
points of view.
Yeah. It strikes me that most not all, most of the folks that are in the actual farming and ranching community where they're landowners themselves and participating landowners are, even if they don't like it, they will begrudgingly recognize that, I don't want to do it, but my neighbor, it's his property and he should be allowed to do it. The one folks that I see that push back the hardest against development are folks that bought a 40 acres or 20 acres or 10 acres in the country, and they don't want to see anything change around them. Those are the folks that tend to put up the most resistance, at least in Colorado, in my experience, to development of renewable facilities.
Yeah.
In Colorado, we have this is a state law in Colorado that if you have 35 acres, the local governing authority can't keep you from building a house, getting a well, et cetera, et cetera. So those are, so if you buy a 35 acre ranchette, you can build your house out there, and it's pretty much a slam dunk. Not necessarily on smaller acres than that, but on the big ones. So those are and folks that buy 35 acres out in the country don't want anything to change around them, even though they don't own
value
it.
the landscape, right?
Yeah,
right. Yeah.
And I get that, but it's not your property. You don't have the unlimited right to look out over my pasture ground and have me not change it. I'm sorry, you don't own my property. It's mine.
Yeah. That's what we'd call, economists would say, that's a positive externality. So you're providing benefits to society or to other people by raising cattle. A lot of people in Kansas feel that way too.
Yeah.
We like seeing the cattle.
Of course. And
yeah.
A solar development would look a lot different than a wheat field. It also won't, especially after it's up and running, you would never have to worry about it blowing dust during the summer fallow year, would you? No.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's understandable.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, it's understandable.
Yeah.
I mean, I get it.
Yeah.
I'm just like, it's my place. You don't have the right to control the vista just because you live here.
Yeah. 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 And one of the issues that I've read about and seen is, most states, we have preferential taxation. All states, all 50 states have preferential taxation for farmland, for agriculture. There's intrinsic value for farming and ranching that's broadly held. I mean, not universally, and it's supported through these taxation policies where you're paying taxes based on the agricultural use value of the land, not alternative uses. There's other state and local policies that sort of, there's sort of where agriculture and farming is valued. And then you have, renewable energy or sort of energy. I mean, that could also, there's other, conventional sources, but tends to be cited on farmland. And so then in some places there's, well, should it go on prime farmland, or should it go on types of farmlands, but they don't want to limit farms. How have you seen that debate evolving?
Well, again, the fallacy of losing farmland or even prime farmland to solar is just that. It's a fallacy. It's a long use of 30 years or 35 years, but
Yeah.
it's still temporary in its nature. The field I'm looking at out here was developed in 1973. It's been in use for
Mhm.
53 years now, and
Yeah.
and it'll still be in use as long as it has water for another 53 years. I don't think that should be a problem. Now, I do think that, and this is done, and taxation is done on a state by state basis, or
Yep.
sometimes county
Yep.
by county basis. But in Colorado, and this should be the case nationwide, and it's probably why we do need to have some clarity on this in the Farm Bill to ensure that the underlying agricultural land maintains its farm number and its base acres at the FSA office, even if in case it goes into a solar development.
Mm.
So that when it comes back out,
Yeah.
it still has its base acres and its farm
I
number, and
think
it
you
qualifies
lose
for.
base right now.
You do.
Yeah, you lose your
And that needs
base.
to be fixed. That has to be fixed at the federal level. At the state level, when it comes to taxation, and Colorado does this, and every other state should do
Yeah.
this. The underlying real estate maintains its ag tax base, and the renewable facility is taxed as a separate entity. And in
Okay.
Colorado, they're taxed based on how much the value of the energy that they produce on an annual basis.
Okay.
I like that better than taxing them based on the cost of the facility. Because if you tax them based on the cost of the facility, it depreciates over time. So your tax base erodes a little bit over time from the
Yeah.
local
Yeah.
level. Whereas if they're taxed the way we do it
Mhm.
here in Colorado, based on the value of the electrons sold on an annual basis, then your taxation rate actually goes up slightly over time. So it's an increasing tax base to the locals as opposed to a decreasing tax base. So those are key policy things that should be addressed at the very different levels. At the federal
Yep.
level,
Yep.
we need to make sure that it retains its farm number and its base acres.
Yep.
That's federal. Actually, we're working on that through the current farm bill. We're trying to get that
Okay,
established
interesting.
during
Yep.
the current farm bill. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
and then
We'll
at the
see if we
state
have
level, you need
one.
to. Yeah, well, if they ever get around to it, I mean,
That's
they're
another
so
whole
dysfunctional in
other
DC right
episode.
now.
Yep.
Oh,
Yep.
and at the state level, you need to make sure that your property maintains its agricultural base for taxation, because again, in 35 years, the solar facility is going away and it's back to agriculture.
So your organization, you have interest in what's in the Farm Bill. There's efforts with state legislatures. Is that the majority of your policy advocacy or policy education efforts? Do you
We
engage with the
anticipate.
local level or do you advise on that?
So yeah, a little bit of both. So again, new organization, and we're just getting off the ground, but we do have, and we anticipate having even more to say at the federal level, at the state level, and then at the local level, wherever the decisions are being made. So we have weighed in on the Farm Bill now. We have weighed in on the moratorium on solar development in the state of Missouri. And we're also trying to help people get prepared to weigh in at the very local level to make sure that if they want to host a facility, their local governing authority will allow it or not shut it down. So we anticipate as an organization, as a trade group, engaging at all three levels. Yes.
Okay, gotcha. Will you partner? I mean, I'm just thinking who represents landowners broadly? Will you partner with, say, like a farm bureau or other organizations, or do you feel like you have a seat at the table based on the mass of landowners you represent?
Yes, and okay. The we know that we started the Renewable Energy Farmers of America because there was no trade organization that looked out just for these interests. But
Yep,
we
yep.
also deeply understand the value of allies who have similar desires. In the Farm Bureau, in most states, Farm Bureau are huge protectors of property rights, and so
Yep, yep.
that lines up. And a lot of times we'll end up with similar
Yeah.
policy and can be allies to get something done together. So yes, we'll end up working hand in glove with a lot of different ag organizations and anticipate doing
Mhm.
that going forward. Absolutely.
Have you sort of, I guess, in terms of allies with renewable energy, it's sort of fascinating because it doesn't always cross your traditional lines. I mean, you could partner with sort of more environmental groups, conservation groups, more progressive groups, but then sometimes they might not. And then, like some of the ag groups you think of as more conservative or focused on property rights. How are you navigating that?
it's like foreign policy. You don't have any permanent friends or permanent enemies. You just have permanent interests.
Yeah.
And our interest
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
representing the farmers and ranchers and landowners that want to host renewable facilities. And so,
Okay.
when that lines up with someone that will help you, then
Okay.
you can work with them on it. No, but you got to remember. So most, not all, but most renewable development happens in ruby red counties. So
Yep.
the progressive environmental groups aren't necessarily going to be helpful to me.
Yep.
So that's when you
Yep.
reach out to the
Mhm.
Farm Bureau and to other folks.
Okay.
And the truth is I mean, we even have, believe it or not, we actually have a lot in common with hydrocarbon developers as well, because the property rights that ensure that you can produce the minerals on a property are the same property rights that ensure I can host a
Okay.
renewable facility here. So we have,
Okay.
similar interests with those guys at that time. Now that said,
Mhm.
they have an interest in making sure that if you do a solar development over someone else's mineral rights, that you leave room in the solar development so that they can have a pad to drill
Yeah.
for oil or natural gas should they decide that
Yeah.
that they need to do that there. And we have all of
Okay.
those interests that have to be lined up
Yeah.
and taken care of, and it just depends.
Okay.
Now, if I'm doing a project up in one of the resort counties in Colorado, like Route County, which is Steamboat Springs, beautiful mountain country,
Yeah.
some of the more progressive groups are great allies up there because
Yeah.
they want to see the carbon free electric
Yeah.
development,
Yeah.
and the local decision makers are all left of center up there. So you end up with a
Yeah.
different group of allies to
Yeah.
advocate for a
Yeah.
project.
Yeah. That must be pretty interesting.
It is in Colorado.
I can imagine. I can imagine. All right, we've spent a lot of time. Are there any other specific? I have a couple questions I'd like to wrap up with, but is there anything else on the sort of the policy side that you'd like to
Yeah, I just,
talk
again, for
about?
me, I'll say this. For me, I am enthusiastic about energy development, be it hydrocarbon or, wind, solar, whatever it is, because
Yeah.
I believe it's great for the economy in rural America. And we have tons of studies that show just how valuable it is to counties that have and host this type of development. So I'm a huge advocate for that because of what it brings from an economic perspective to rural America. It might only be 10 jobs, but in a town of 2,000 people like Ray, Colorado, 10 jobs is very, very noticeable. And that's potentially 10 kids that graduate from Ray High School who won't have to go, to the Front Range to find a job. They could stay, they could have a
Yeah.
great paying job in their home community and stay here. I mean, I think I
Yeah.
graduated 53 kids. I think 7 or 8 of us actually stayed in the community. Everybody else left.
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
kind of normal for rural communities.
Certainly understand
Yeah.
that.
So any kind of energy development, any kind of development at all, creates opportunities for people to stay in their home community. So I just love doing it for that
Yeah.
reason.
All right. All right. So is there, think about, I guess, maybe more from a policy perspective in the work you're doing. Is there one thing you're pessimistic about right now and one thing you're more optimistic about?
Yeah, the pessimism is just how nasty and political the pushback against development has become. It's it's completely unnecessary. What I'm optimistic about is that it's becoming really obvious that you want to have an all of the above energy strategy so that you're not locked into coal, nuclear, natural gas. So you have a diversified fuel stream, basically, and a diversified way of generating the electrons for the grid so that you can kind of match up with the area that you're in. So if you're in Arizona, it might be solar. If you're in Iowa or South Dakota or eastern Colorado or Kansas, it might be wind along with some solar. So I really like that. I'm very optimistic about the advancements that they are making in battery electric storage systems.
That's huge.
Lithium. Yeah, the new lithium iron phosphate batteries are, I mean, ridiculously safe. They have, you almost can't make them go thermal now. So the stories that you saw about batteries catching on fire is all from technology that's no longer being used at all. And so
Okay.
so making some great strides in that
Yeah.
area, which will help us to continue to diversify our stream and keep the cost of electricity low, because you can
Storage.
charge those batteries up at night when the wind's blowing, and basically it's practically free electricity,
Yeah.
and then
Yeah. You
discharge
can
them.
literally go off the grid.
Yeah, and just
Yeah.
discharge those batteries when electricity is more valuable and just watch that, those peaks of electricity costs just get completely shaved off. And we're seeing that writ large in Texas now. They're really pioneering how to use batteries in Texas. So I'm really optimistic about that. So that
What's the one thing that you feel the most misunderstood about with what you're doing?
probably just it has negative externalities for a community. I just don't see that there may be some, but to the extent that there are some, they are by far and away overshadowed by the positives that you get
Yeah.
out of development of a project in your community. Or just,
All
the
right.
tax revenue, the job opportunities, the royalty payments to the landowners, all that stuff just creates more wealth for the community. I just published a piece in the Fence Post here last week or the week before where I reminded everybody that in rural Colorado, what we do is turn natural resources into wealth that we export out of the community. So, for instance, we don't eat all of the wheat that we grow in Yuma County. We export it to someone else. We don't eat all of the
Absolutely.
beef that we grow here. We export it to somebody else. The natural gas that's produced in Weld County is only partially used in Weld County. The rest of it goes to the rest of the world. And all of the
Yep.
cheese that is made in Greeley, Colorado, or Fort Morgan, Colorado, goes to all of the pizzas across the entire country. So we're going to make electrons here and ship them somewhere else as well. And we're going to
Yep.
create wealth that stays right here.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. So what if you got to change one policy? What would that be?
That the probably the biggest thing that I would like to see when it comes to renewable energy is just to establish the property right that you have by dint of ownership of that real estate, that you get to develop it within the community guidelines. So if you want to build a feedlot or a dairy on your property, you should be allowed to do that. Now, should there be setbacks so that it doesn't have real negative repercussions for somebody living with literally across the road? Absolutely. But for me, establishing the primacy of property rights is my number one policy concern that I like to see fixed when it comes to renewable energy. Now, as a country, we've been 80 years kind of sliding in the wrong direction. So there's not one single policy that solves America's problems, but I still believe in America, and I think we'll be back on track eventually here.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's a great way to wrap up. Really appreciate your time, all the information you shared. Sounds like you're really willing to engage, and you must have a thick skin with
Yeah, if you
some of.
believe, I
Yeah,
believe in, and I love rural America. So I want to, when you're convinced that what you're doing is helpful to your community, you can put up with some detraction.
yeah, yeah. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much.
You bet.